I never wanted to talk about this. It happened years ago, but I still can't shake the feeling that she's out there somewhere, waiting for me to let my guard down. Most nights, I can convince myself it's over. I go to bed, close my eyes, and pretend I'm normal. But there are other nights, the bad ones, when I can still see her standing there watching me from the trees. This all happened during a solo trip I took in the summer of 2018. I wasn't in a good place back then. Work was falling apart. My relationship had just ended, and I felt like I was choking on my own life. I needed space, time to breathe, so I rented a small cabin up in the northern woods of Michigan. The kind of place with no neighbors for miles, just trees and water and silence. It was perfect, or at least I thought it was. The cabin sat right on the edge of a lake. Not big, maybe a few hundred yards across. The water was dark, surrounded by thick pine trees on all sides. There was a narrow dock stretching over the water, a small fire pit out front, and a single dirt road that led in and out. It was quiet, peaceful, exactly what I needed. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, made a fire, and sat by the water until the sun dipped behind the trees. The air smelled like pine and smoke. I remember feeling calm for the first time in months. I stayed up late reading and fell asleep with the windows open, letting the cool night air fill the room. It wasn't until the second day that things started to feel off. I was out by the dock, drinking coffee and watching the water when I noticed her. She was standing on the opposite shore, right where the trees met the water. I could barely make her out at first, just a figure in the distance. She wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the lake. I thought maybe she was a hiker. It wasn't common to see people out there, but it wasn't impossible. I kept watching, waiting for her to move, but she didn't. She stood there for what must have been 10 minutes, perfectly still. I started to feel uneasy. I waved. Nothing. I called out, just a quick hello. Still nothing. After a while, I convinced myself it didn't matter. Maybe she was just standing there. Maybe she didn't hear me. I went back inside, but the whole day I couldn't shake the image of her standing there. So still it didn't seem natural. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept looking out the window toward the lake, half expecting to see her again. But the shore was empty. The water was still. Around midnight, I finally dozed off, and then the tapping started. It was soft at first, just a light, rhythmic tap coming from the front porch. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I held my breath, listening. It didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. Slow and steady, like someone lightly knocking with their knuckles. I checked the time. 2:12 a.m. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, a branch tapping against the porch. But I knew it wasn't. I could feel it. There was a weight to it, something deliberate. I got up quietly, my hands shaking. I crept toward the window that faced the porch, moving slow enough that the floorboards wouldn't creak. I barely breathed. When I reached the window, I pulled back the curtain just an inch. She was standing on the porch. I felt my stomach drop. She was facing the door, her head tilted slightly to one side. She wasn't knocking with her hand. She was tapping with something thin. A stick, maybe. Slow and rhythmic, as if she had all the time in the world. I couldn't see her face clearly in the dark. Her hair was long and tangled, hanging over her shoulders. She wore a long, dark jacket that looked soaked through, like she had been standing in the rain. But there was no rain. I don't know how long I stood there, staring. My heart was pounding so hard I thought she would hear it. I wanted to move, to grab my phone, to do something, but I felt frozen, like if I moved, she would know. And then she stopped. She lowered the stick slowly, resting it against her leg. For a moment, she just stood there, breathing. Then she turned, stepped off the porch, and walked back toward the trees. She didn't run. She didn't hurry. She walked calmly, like she had all the time in the world. I stayed awake until the sun came up. I sat by the window, knife in my hand, staring at the tree-line. I wanted to believe it was over, that she was gone. But I knew better. I found the stick on the porch the next morning. It was thin and brittle, snapped in half where she had tapped it against the wood. That afternoon, I drove into town. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't want to sound crazy. I stocked up on food, locked every door and window, and told myself I was overreacting. That night, the tapping came back. This time, it was at the back door. I didn't get up. I sat there in the dark, holding the knife, my heart racing. The taps were softer this time, slower. I kept waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. It went on for hours, tap after tap, slow and steady. When the sun came up, I opened the back door. There were wet footprints leading from the trees to the door, bare feet. I packed my things and left that morning. I didn't even bother locking the cabin. I drove straight home, checking the rearview mirror the whole way. I kept expecting to see her walking down the road behind me. It's been years now. I haven't been back, but sometimes late at night I still hear it. That slow, steady tapping, and I wonder if she ever stopped. I don't talk about what happened at Ridgeway Lake. I've tried to forget it, to push it so far down that it becomes another one of those memories that lose shape over time. But this one won't fade. It sits in my chest like a weight. I've stopped trying to convince myself I imagined it. It happened, and if I'm being honest, I'm lucky to be alive. I rented the cabin because I needed a break. I know that sounds like the start of a cliche, some overworked guy looking for a weekend in the woods, but that's exactly what it was. My job was draining me. My relationships were strained. I felt like I was walking through my life on autopilot, numb to everything. I just wanted a few days to breathe, to clear my head. Ridgeway Lake is about 3 hours from where I live, tucked into the northern woods with nothing but trees for miles. The cabin was small, more like a hunting shack, no Wi-Fi, no cell service. I liked that about it. I didn't want distractions. I packed light, a couple of books, some food, a flashlight, and a hunting knife I'd barely ever used. I wasn't expecting to need it. The drive out was uneventful. 2 hours of highways, then an hour of winding back roads that twisted through the woods. By the time I got there, the sun was just starting to set. The cabin sat right at the edge of the lake, with a narrow dock stretching over the water. It was peaceful, quiet, the kind of place where you could sit for hours and hear nothing but the wind. But even then, something felt off. It's hard to explain. It wasn't anything obvious. The place looked normal enough. Just a small wooden cabin with a tin roof, a fire pit out front, and a shed leaning slightly to one side. But there was this tension in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. I brushed it off. I was here to relax, not psych myself out. I spent the first evening by the lake, watching the sun dip below the trees. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the sky like glass. I stayed out until the light faded, then went inside and built a fire in the wood stove. The warmth filled the room quickly. I made dinner, read for a while, and went to bed early. That night, I woke up to the sound of knocking. It wasn't loud, just 3 soft, deliberate knocks coming from the front door. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding harder than it should have. I checked my phone out of habit, but of course, there was no signal. I sat there listening. Nothing. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and crept to the window. I didn't turn on the lights. I just peeked out through the curtain. The porch was empty. The woods beyond it were dark and still. I stood there for a long time, waiting for something to move. Didn't. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the sound of the house settling or a branch hitting the roof. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I checked the porch. I half expected to find something, footprints maybe, but there was nothing, just damp wood and a thin layer of pine needles. I made coffee, sat by the water for a while, and tried to forget about it, but the feeling stayed with me, that heavy, sinking feeling in my gut. I went for a hike that afternoon. The trail circled the lake and wound through the woods for a few miles before looping back. The air felt thick, heavy with humidity. As I walked, I kept hearing things, soft rustling, the snap of a branch, but every time I stopped to look, there was nothing. I told myself it was wildlife. I was in the woods. It was normal, but about 2 miles in, I found something strange. A campsite, or at least what was left of one. There was a tent, or what was left of it, collapsed in on itself, torn at the seams. A rusted camping stove lay half-buried in the dirt. Clothes were scattered everywhere, some torn, some soaked through with rain. It looked like it had been abandoned for weeks. And the strange thing was, there were no bags, no food, no personal belongings, just the tent and the clothes. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. My first thought was that someone had packed up and left in a hurry. But why leave everything behind? I didn't stay long. I made my way back to the cabin, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped to listen, the woods went silent. No wind, no birds, just nothing. I locked the doors that night, bolted the windows. I kept the fire burning, more for comfort than warmth. I sat in the armchair by the window, staring out at the woods. And then, just past midnight, the knocking started again. 3 slow, heavy knocks. I froze. My hands were shaking. I stared at the front door, heart pounding. Felt different this time, more deliberate, like someone knew I was awake. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen. My palms were slick with sweat. I crept to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to see outside. There was someone standing by the tree-line. They were far enough away that I couldn't make out their face, but I could see the shape of them, tall, standing perfectly still, facing the cabin. I stared for what felt like forever, waiting for them to move. They didn't. I sat there for hours, watching. By the time the sun came up, they were gone. I packed my bags that morning. I didn't care if I had another night booked. I threw everything in the car and drove down the dirt road, checking the rearview mirror the whole way. I kept expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me, but I didn't. It wasn't until I got home that I noticed the mud on my back bumper. A single handprint smeared across the metal. I called the property owner to ask about the campsite I found. They told me no one had rented the cabin in months. I don't go hiking anymore. I don't camp. I don't even drive through the woods if I can help it, because sometimes at night, I still hear the knocking. And I wonder if they ever really left. I rented a small off-grid cabin deep in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The listing said it was 20 miles from the nearest paved road, and that sounded perfect to me. I'd been needing a break from people, from phones, from the noise of everything. I took time off work and drove north, packed my car with canned food, dry goods, a first aid kit, and some gear. The cabin had a wood stove, a creek nearby, and no power or plumbing. It seemed like a dream. I arrived in late September. The air was already getting crisp, the trees turning that deep red and yellow that always hits before the heavy winds strip them bare. The drive-in was rough, mud ruts, narrow turns, and no cell service. I followed the hand-drawn map from the owner and finally found the cabin tucked into a cluster of pine trees. It looked smaller than the pictures, but sturdy. The roof was intact, the front porch was sagging a little, and the single chimney was spitting out a thin line of smoke. The owner said he had someone stop by once a week to check on it. There was an old truck parked just off the clearing. It looked abandoned. Flat tires, rust all around the fenders, moss on the windows. I figured it had been there a while. The cabin door was latched shut with a wood beam across the inside, just like the owner told me. I set my things down, opened the windows to let it air out, and got a fire going. I spent the rest of that evening chopping firewood and carrying buckets of water from the creek back up the trail. That first night was quiet. Too quiet, actually. No wind, no owls, not even the sound of water from the creek. I thought maybe I was just hyper-aware, listening too hard for things. I sat by the fire and read for a bit, then went to sleep early. The bed was musty but fine. The cabin had one room with a small cot in the corner, a table and chair, a wood stove, and a shelf with some old tools and lanterns. There was a trapdoor in the corner that led to a cellar, but it was nailed shut. The owner told me not to bother with it. It was just old storage. The next few days passed slowly. I spent my time walking around the woods, fishing in the creek, and watching the sun rise and fall over the trees. I saw a few deer and a black bear in the distance. Nothing strange, no people. That was the whole point. But on the 5th night, something started to feel off. It was just after dark, and I was sitting by the stove, writing in a small notebook. I kept hearing what sounded like movement outside. Not animals running, but footsteps, slow and heavy. I froze and listened, came and went, like someone walking the perimeter of the cabin. I didn't have a gun with me, just a hatchet and a large knife I used for clearing brush. I grabbed the knife and quietly moved to the front window. I didn't see anything, just trees and dark. The sounds stopped after a while. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe my imagination. I went to bed but barely slept. Every sound made me sit up. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard something tapping the side of the cabin. Not hard, just enough to make me open my eyes and listen again. But it didn't happen again. The next morning, I walked around the cabin and looked for tracks. The ground was soft from rain the night before. I found 2 prints near the back wall. They weren't boot prints. They looked like bare feet, adult size. The toes were clear in the mud. I stood there staring at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. There weren't any other signs. No trail, no trash, no broken branches. Just those 2 prints. I thought about leaving. I packed my bag and walked to my car. When I tried to start it, nothing happened. The battery was dead. I hadn't left any lights on, and the battery was brand new. I popped the hood and checked the terminals. They were clean. I tried again. Nothing. Just a click. That didn't make sense to me. It wasn't cold enough to freeze it out. I went back to the cabin and sat on the porch for a long time. I kept scanning the woods, half expecting to see someone. But nothing moved. That day dragged. I didn't go for my usual walk. I kept close, chopping more wood and sharpening my hatchet. That night, the noises came back. Same pattern, slow, steady steps, circling, then tapping. This time, it was on the window. I stayed low, crawling to the side. I held my breath. The tapping stopped. I waited there, knife in hand, until my legs cramped. I stayed up all night. The next morning, I walked a quarter mile down the trail just to see if I could find any signs of someone living nearby. I found nothing. No campsites, no trash, no tools. Just empty woods. But when I got back, I saw something on the front porch. It was a dead bird. Its neck was broken, and it had been placed neatly in the center of the top step. That got to me. It wasn't random. Felt like a message. I dragged a bench in front of the door and nailed it across. I blocked the windows with old towels and nailed up some boards I found behind the cabin. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want the smoke giving me away. I ate cold food and sat in the dark with my back against the wall, listening. The steps came again, but this time they didn't stop. They came right up to the door. Then nothing. I held my breath so long I started to feel dizzy. I finally moved to the window and peeked through a crack. I saw something standing near the old truck. Just a shape. It was tall and still. Then it walked back into the woods. I watched until the sun came up. By now, I was running low on food. I needed to find help. The car was dead, and I didn't want to walk 20 miles through thick woods without a clear trail. But I didn't have much choice. I packed a bag with water, food, my knife, and a flashlight. I left just after noon. The walk was long. I kept stopping, turning, listening. I thought I was being followed, but every time I stopped, it was quiet. By nightfall, I was maybe 10 miles out. I set up a small camp, no fire, and slept with my bag against a tree. The next morning, I kept walking. I finally got a weak signal on my phone and called for help. A ranger met me by the road around noon. I told him I'd been staying at a cabin and thought someone had been stalking me. He offered to go back with me, but I said no. I just wanted out. I never went back to that cabin. I contacted the owner and told him what happened. He didn't sound surprised. He just said he'd send someone to check on it. I don't know who was out there or why, but I know I wasn't imagining it. I still think about the prints, the tapping, the dead bird. That kind of fear sticks with you. Even now, I still wake up at night thinking I hear footsteps outside my window. I rented the cabin for a full week because I needed a break. Not a break like people usually mean, the kind where you still carry your phone everywhere and check in with the world every 5 minutes. I wanted real silence, real space, something where I could feel like I wasn't tethered to anything. The cabin I found online was exactly what I was looking for. Secluded, small, and surrounded by trees. It sat near a lake with no neighbors for at least a few miles in any direction. The photos showed a weathered dock, a canoe, and one dusty trail that led in and out of the woods. I left on a Monday morning. I drove 6 hours up from the city, and the last hour was nothing but gravel and dirt. My tires kicked up clouds, and branches scraped the sides of my car. There were no signs, no intersections, no reception. Just one road in and that same road out. When I finally got there, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures, maybe even older. The porch sagged a little, and the wooden steps creaked, but it held together. Inside, it was basic. A bed, a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bathroom that looked like it had been updated in the early 2000s and never touched since. I unpacked slowly, tried the lights, they worked. The water ran, although it sputtered a bit, and the heat came from a propane unit near the corner. I made a mental note to be careful with it. The first day was peaceful. I walked around the lake, fished a little with the cheap gear the owner had left, and watched the sun go down from the end of the dock. By the time I got back inside, it was dark. Not city dark, total dark. I'd brought some books and had a few meals planned out, so I made pasta, ate in silence, and fell asleep early. The second day I spent exploring deeper into the woods. The trees around the cabin were thick but passable. I followed the trail for about 2 hours, not really going anywhere, just seeing where it led. I passed old tree stumps, a pile of rocks that could have been from an old structure, and what looked like remnants of a hunting blind. It was quiet out there, quiet in a way that made me pause every so often just to take it in. Felt untouched, like no one had walked there in years. When I got back that night, I noticed something odd. The propane heater was off. I didn't remember turning it off. I was sure I'd left it low, just enough to keep the cabin from freezing. I shrugged it off. Maybe I'd hit the knob by accident, or maybe the wind through the poorly sealed windows had snuffed it out. I turned it back on, warmed up, and went to bed. That night, I kept waking up. Not from sounds, at least not any I could remember, but from a feeling. The kind of feeling you get when someone's standing over you, even though no one is. Every time I opened my eyes, I saw nothing. Just the ceiling or the dim light from the propane unit flickering. Still, I didn't sleep well. I kept checking the front door latch, the window locks. Everything was shut. On the third day, things started to shift. I went down to the dock that morning and noticed footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet. Bare feet in the mud, leading up the shore and disappearing into the grass near the tree line. They were faint but unmistakable. I stared at them for a long time, trying to explain them. Maybe someone else had come by the lake. Maybe an animal, though they didn't look like animal prints. Too human, too deliberate. I followed them a bit, but they faded fast. I told myself it was nothing, but I didn't spend much time near the dock after that. I decided to chop some firewood from the small pile near the shed out back, just to keep busy. The axe was rusted but usable. As I worked, I kept looking over my shoulder. The woods felt different. Not louder, just more present. Like they were watching. The wind had picked up and I could hear it rushing through the branches. But under that, there was something else. Like faint movement. I kept thinking I saw shadows darting between trees, but every time I stopped and looked, it was empty. That night, I brought the axe inside. I locked the door and checked the windows again. I didn't turn off the propane unit. I wanted to keep warm. I lay in bed, reading until I dozed off. In the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time I was sure I'd heard something. Not outside, inside. A creak on the floorboards. I stayed completely still and listened. Another creak. Closer. I reached for the axe I'd leaned next to the bed. My breathing was slow and shallow, and I didn't move. I lay there for a long time until nothing else happened. Then, just before dawn, I got up and checked every room. There was nothing out of place. But on the inside of the front door, there was a smudge, a muddy handprint, small, not child-sized, but not large either. I stared at it for a long time, then opened the door and checked outside. No footprints, no tire tracks, just pine needles and cold air. I shut the door and pushed the couch in front of it. I didn't go exploring that day. I stayed inside and kept the axe with me. I didn't turn on the propane unit, even though it got cold. I didn't want the noise. I wanted to be able to hear everything. By now, I had the feeling I wasn't alone. I couldn't prove it, but the signs were piling up. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall, axe in hand, and waited. That night, I didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Creaks, slow ones, like someone taking careful steps. Not from outside, from the loft area above the main room. I hadn't even gone up there since arriving. It was just an open space, half-finished, with storage boxes. I held my breath and waited. Another creak. I stood up quietly and walked toward the ladder. I didn't go up, not right away. I stared into the shadows above and listened. Nothing. Then I turned on my flashlight and climbed slowly. At the top, I shined the light around. Boxes, an old mattress, some broken furniture, and then I saw the blanket, folded into the corner like a makeshift bed. Next to it was an empty can of beans, a spoon, trash. Someone had been sleeping up there. Recently, I didn't move. I didn't shout. I just backed down the ladder, heart pounding, and quietly moved outside. I went to the shed, locked myself in, and waited until morning. The shed was cold and smelled like oil and old wood, but I didn't care. I sat on the floor, axe in hand, and listened. Once the sun came up, I went back in. The cabin was quiet. I climbed the ladder again, this time with the axe ready. The blanket was still there, the can, the spoon, but no one. Whoever had been up there was gone, or hiding. I searched every corner of the cabin, opened every drawer, checked the attic crawl space. Nothing, but I knew what I saw. I didn't stay another night. I packed my things fast and drove out. That one road felt like it took forever. My tires slipped on the gravel more than once, but I didn't stop. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to step out into the road. I made it to the nearest town and found a gas station with reception. I called the rental agency and told them I was done early. I didn't say why. I just said it wasn't what I expected. That night, I stayed at a motel. Bright lights, neighbors, a lock that worked. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't hear any footsteps either. 2 weeks later, the agency emailed me. They said they'd gone to inspect the property and found signs that someone had broken in. A window latch had been forced, and someone had been living in the loft. They asked if I'd seen anything. I didn't reply. I don't think it was random. I think whoever it was had been living there a while, watching, waiting, maybe even while I was searching the woods or sitting at the dock. They knew I was there. They were quiet, careful, and they never left any sign until they wanted me to know. I haven't rented a cabin since. I don't think I ever will. That feeling of being watched, of not being alone, it doesn't go away. Not really. Even now, sometimes when I'm home, I'll hear a creak in the hallway or a thump upstairs, and I'll freeze, just for a second, and wonder if someone followed me back. I took a week off work and drove up to a cabin in the Appalachians. It was late October, and the leaves were full of color, but the mornings had that dead cold stillness that reminded me winter wasn't far off. I didn't pick the place because it was fancy. It was basic: wood walls, a metal roof, a fireplace, a cot. No electricity, no plumbing, just a wood stove and an outhouse out back. That's what I was looking for. I needed to be alone. Needed to not hear the noise of my phone or people or traffic. I needed quiet. I found the cabin through a small rental site. It was owned by some older couple who didn't even live in the area anymore. The directions were handwritten and a little hard to follow, but I figured it out. Took me almost half a day to get there, winding through back roads and finally up a dirt path that barely looked like it had been driven on in years. The cabin sat in a clearing, ringed by trees, with a little creek just off to one side and a fire pit someone had built with stones. There was a woodshed out back, and a broken-down canoe leaned against one wall like it hadn't touched water in a decade. The place smelled like pine and dust. A pile of dry wood was stacked in the corner, and there were spider webs in the rafters. I swept the floor and unpacked. I'd brought canned food, water jugs, a flashlight, batteries, a knife, a few books. I didn't plan on doing much, just reading, sleeping, walking the woods. The first night was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get deep in the woods, where the air feels thicker and there's nothing to compete with the sound of the wind in the branches. I sat by the fire for a while, then turned in early. The cot wasn't comfortable, but I didn't mind. I slept fine. The second day, I hiked a little ways into the woods behind the cabin. There wasn't a trail, but it was open enough to walk through. I followed the creek for maybe an hour. It was shallow, full of cold, clear water and slippery rocks. I saw some deer tracks, a few old beer cans half buried in the dirt, and one old hunting blind up in a tree that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I turned back before it got dark and made a fire outside that night. The third day, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air felt heavier. The woods seemed too still. I didn't hear birds that morning, and even the creek sounded quieter. I went outside and walked the perimeter of the cabin, not looking for anything in particular, just trying to shake the feeling. I saw what looked like a boot print near the edge of the clearing. It wasn't mine. It was bigger, and the sole had a different pattern. I crouched and stared at it for a while, then walked back inside and locked the door. That night, I kept the fire going in the stove and sat in the dark, just listening. I didn't sleep much. I heard twigs snapping around 2 a.m., maybe 30 feet from the cabin. I couldn't see anything out the window, but I knew something was out there. It didn't sound like a deer or raccoon. It was slower, heavier. I stayed still in the cot, barely breathing. After a while, it stopped, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found something I hadn't left. A piece of string, about a foot long, tied into a loop, laid in front of the door. It wasn't frayed or dirty. It looked clean. I hadn't brought any string like that. I picked it up, then dropped it, suddenly sick to my stomach. Someone had been there. Someone had come right up to the door. I looked around again, no more tracks, nothing obvious. Just that loop of string. I left it where it was and spent the rest of the day chopping wood and pretending to be busy. That evening, I tried to enjoy the fire, but every little sound put me on edge. The wind through the trees started to sound like footsteps. I kept the axe next to the door and made sure the cabin was locked up tight. The cot felt smaller that night, the walls thinner. At 3 a.m., I heard something tap the window, just once. A soft, deliberate tap. Then it was quiet again. I didn't move. I didn't shine the flashlight. I just laid there, every muscle tense. I must have stayed like that until dawn. When I finally got the nerve to check, there were faint smudges on the outside of the glass, like fingerprints. No full handprints, just smudges in odd little arcs. I didn't know what to make of them, but they hadn't been there before. I was sure of that. On the 5th day, I decided to hike out. Not leave exactly, but just walk back down the road to where I had cell signal and check for messages. Maybe clear my head. The road was quiet. I didn't see any tire tracks but my own. After an hour of walking, I got signal. I had a few missed calls from work. Nothing serious. But what caught my eye was a text from a number I didn't recognize. It just said, "You okay up there?" I stared at it for a long time, then checked the number. It wasn't saved. I texted back, asked who it was, but there was no reply. I waited 10 minutes. Nothing. I deleted the message, then turned around and walked back fast. When I got to the cabin, the door was slightly open. I froze. I knew I'd locked it. I always locked it. I stood in the clearing for maybe 5 minutes, just watching the door, half expecting someone to walk out. Nothing did. I picked up a thick branch, crept up the steps, and pushed the door open the rest of the way. The inside looked the same, mostly. My things were still there, but the axe was missing, the one I kept by the door. I checked every corner of the cabin, but it was gone. I backed out, pulled the door shut, and sat on the porch until it got dark. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against the wall, flashlight and knife in hand. I didn't hear anything. No tapping, no footsteps, just silence. But it was worse than noise. It felt like the woods were holding their breath, like something was watching. The 6th morning, I went outside and saw that the loop of string was back. This time, it was on the woodpile. tied the same way, clean, not dirty, not weathered. I didn't touch it. I stood there staring at it until my skin felt cold. Then I went back inside and packed everything. I didn't care that I had another night left. I wasn't going to stay. I loaded the car in under 10 minutes, locked the cabin for whatever good that did, and drove down the road fast, tires spitting gravel. I didn't stop until I hit the first gas station an hour and a half away. I sat in the parking lot with the engine running, just staring out the windshield. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, but they were close, watching, leaving things, coming right up to the windows. They didn't break in to steal anything. They didn't try to hurt me. They just watched. That's what stuck with me most. The watching. I never reported it. I never told the owners. I left a review that said, "Cabin was fine, pretty isolated, nothing else." I didn't want anyone asking questions. I didn't want to have to think about the string or the missing axe or the text. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about it. That kind of patience, that kind of quiet, the kind of person who can stand in the woods for hours, not moving, not making a sound, just watching. And I think about how many other cabins are out there just like that one, and how many people go up into the woods to get away from everything, not knowing who's already there, waiting in the dark. I rented a cabin in northern Minnesota for a week in early November, just before the deep freeze sets in. I had been looking for a place to get away from everything: work, emails, traffic, people. I found this one on a listing site. Small, simple, remote, backed into the woods near a lake that was already starting to skim over with ice. There was a wood stove, a propane heater, a cot, and not much else. That was perfect for me. I packed up my car, brought enough food and water for the week, and headed up early in the morning. The drive was long. Once I passed Duluth, I barely saw any cars. I followed a few county roads, then gravel, then just dirt. The trees thickened, and the sky got darker, like it always does up north. The GPS signal faded right as I reached the little turnoff with the old green sign pointing toward the lake. I followed that path, slow and careful, until I saw the cabin. It was about what I expected. Wood-sided, roof half covered in leaves, a little front porch with a bench, and an old metal chimney poking out of the top. The lake was about 100 yards out, down a path of dead pine needles and frost-hardened earth. I parked the car off to the side, grabbed my duffel and cooler, and went in. It smelled like dry wood and dust. A few mouse droppings in the corner, but I didn't care. I swept up, lit the stove, and settled in. I had brought books, a little solar power bank for my phone, and a notebook I never used back home. The first 2 days were peaceful, cold, quiet, and just the way I wanted. I read, made coffee, sat by the lake bundled up in a parka. I saw deer tracks, some raccoon prints, even heard a few loons early one morning. I had no cell signal, but I didn't expect any. I checked the propane every night before bed, stacked the firewood inside, and double-locked the door out of habit more than anything. By the third day, I started noticing a few weird things. Started small. One morning, I found a stick laid across the front steps, straight, about a foot long. I thought maybe it fell from the trees overhead, though it didn't really make sense with how it was placed. Didn't think much of it. Then I started seeing small impressions in the frost outside the cabin. Not quite tracks, just indents, like someone had been walking through the yard in heavy boots, and the ground had just started to refreeze around them. They were far apart, not like steps, more like someone had been standing in one place, then another. I looked for signs of animals, but these were too deep, too sharp. Still, I brushed it off. On the fifth night, I was woken up around 2 in the morning. I had turned in early, the wood stove burning slow, wrapped in my sleeping bag. There was this sharp thud on the wall, just once, enough to make me sit up fast. I grabbed the flashlight, heart pounding. It wasn't the roof, this came from the side of the cabin. I waited, didn't hear anything else, and told myself maybe a branch fell. But I stayed up for the rest of the night, flashlight beside me, too on edge to sleep. The next morning, I went outside and checked the side of the cabin. There was a fresh mark on the siding, almost like someone had hit it with something hard. I walked the perimeter but saw no tracks, No signs of animals. I went down to the lake, thinking maybe someone had come through there, but it was still untouched. No broken ice, no footprints. That evening, as I brought more wood in, I realized a few logs were missing from the stack I'd made beside the porch. I knew how many I brought over. I'd been doing it in the same rhythm every day. Not many people could even find the place, and there were no other cabins for miles. It made no sense. I felt this slow churn in my stomach and went inside early. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the stove, boots still on, flashlight and hatchet on the floor next to me. I kept the lamp off. I just listened. Hours went by, and I started to feel stupid. But then, around 3 a.m., I heard movement. Not close, but definite. Sticks cracking out in the woods, something slow, maybe 100 feet off. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like footsteps, dragging through the underbrush. Kept going for 10 minutes, circling, then fading away. I stayed right where I was until morning. When I went out to look, there were no tracks again, just frost melted in patches around the cabin. I realized the sun barely hit this spot. Whatever melted it was body heat. It didn't melt from sunlight. I packed a go bag and kept it near the door after that. By the 6th day, I was running on nerves. Every sound outside made me freeze. The woods felt wrong, silent in a way that wasn't peaceful anymore. Even the birds had gone quiet. That afternoon, I heard something again from the trees. I stepped out slowly and saw movement. Just a flash, like a figure ducking behind a tree. It was fast. I shouted out without thinking, instinct maybe, but nothing answered. The hair on my neck stood up. I backed inside and locked everything. That night, I didn't light the stove. I wanted the cabin dark. I sat by the window with the flashlight off, watching. Hours went by. Around 1 a.m., I saw a flicker out by the tree line. Not light, movement. Something shifted. Then again, closer. A figure, tall, maybe 6 feet, moved from one tree to another. Couldn't see a face, just the shape of a person. I watched as it stepped closer, pausing every few yards. It was walking toward the cabin. My hands were shaking. I stayed still, trying not to breathe too loud. It got within 50 feet. Then it stopped, just stood there. I couldn't tell if it was looking at me. It didn't move for 20 minutes. Then it turned and walked away, slow, disappearing into the woods. At dawn, I made the decision to leave. I stuffed everything into the bag, loaded up the car, and didn't stop to eat. I didn't check the firewood or the lake. I just wanted out. The car took a second to turn over in the cold, and that second felt like forever. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I looked back once. On the porch was another stick, just like the one from before, straight, clean, placed carefully. Someone had been watching me. I knew it. They'd been in the woods the whole time. Maybe from the first day. I didn't see them, but they saw me. I drove until I reached Signal, called the local sheriff's office, and told them what happened. They said they'd send someone out to check. I don't know if they ever did. I never heard back. I never went back for the deposit or the cooler I left behind. I didn't care. That cabin had eyes on it, and I was lucky to get out. I think someone lives out in those woods. Someone who watches cabins like that, maybe waits for people who come alone. Maybe they just like to scare people. Or maybe they were waiting for a reason to do more. Either way, I won't ever go back. Not to that cabin. Not to that part of the state. There's something out there, something human, and that's what scares me the most. I was looking forward to being alone. Things had been heavy at work lately. I had a way of carrying everything on my shoulders, and after months of long hours, late nights, and waking up with my jaw clenched tight enough to give me a headache by breakfast, I decided I needed to get out. I didn't want to see anyone. I didn't want to answer emails or listen to anyone talk about deadlines or metrics or any of that noise. I just wanted quiet, something that didn't involve a screen or traffic or fluorescent lights. I had found a cabin through a small listing site a friend had mentioned months ago. It wasn't on any of the bigger rental platforms. Just a little page, simple layout, no reviews. But it looked all right in the pictures. Nothing fancy. Just a small wooden place tucked up in a heavily wooded area off a gravel road about an hour from the nearest real town. The kind of place people drive past and forget is even there. That's what I wanted. Took me 6 hours to get there. Most of that was spent just getting out of the city and then taking slower roads once I was up in the hills. The last part of the drive was rough. Dirt switchbacks, potholes, tree branches tapping at the windshield. My cell signal disappeared about 15 minutes before I pulled in. I had expected that. The cabin was smaller than the pictures had made it look, but that didn't bother me. It sat just off the edge of a small clearing, maybe 40 yards across, with dense forest pressing in on all sides. A little porch out front, an old deck chair that looked like it hadn't been sat in for years, and one dim porch light that flickered when I flipped the switch. Inside, it was basic. A single room setup with a bed in one corner, a small kitchen area in another, and a narrow bathroom with a door that didn't fully close unless you lifted it by the handle. It smelled like wood and dust and a bit like stale coffee, but it wasn't gross or anything, just old. There was no TV, no internet, not even a radio. There was electricity, though, and a gas stove, and enough firewood stacked beside the little wood stove to keep a small fire going for days. I unpacked slowly, taking my time, trying to unwind my brain. I had brought too much stuff. Books I knew I wouldn't read, food for a week even though I was only staying 3 nights, a heavy flashlight, a second flashlight, 3 pocket knives for some reason. I set everything out, made a cup of instant coffee, and sat on the edge of the porch as the light faded. It was quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. Not just the lack of traffic or talking or city noise, but that real, heavy quiet you only get deep in the woods. The kind where you can hear the creak of trees swaying, the wings of birds as they fly over, the little rustle of squirrels or whatever else in the brush. I sat for a long time that first night, just listening. Eventually, I went inside and read for a while by the yellow glow of the overhead light, then turned in early. The bed wasn't comfortable, but I slept hard. I woke up to the sound of birds and the light cutting through the small curtain. I stayed in bed longer than I usually do, stretching, staring at the ceiling. Took a while for my mind to stop spinning with old work thoughts. I kept catching myself thinking about meetings or emails I wasn't getting. I hated that. Eventually I got up, made some oatmeal on the gas stove, and decided to walk. There was no trail, not really, but I could tell from the way the trees spaced out in some places that people had walked through before. I stayed close at first, then pushed a little further, always making mental notes of landmarks. A mossy stump shaped like a chair, a narrow birch with a deep split near the base, a tree with old barbed wire nailed into it, long rusted and useless. I didn't go too far that first day, just enough to break a sweat and feel the ache in my legs when I got back. I cooked some rice and beans, then read again until my eyes were too heavy to keep open. The second day, I went further. I left around mid-morning and packed a small bag with water, some snacks, a knife, and my flashlight. I followed the same rough path I had taken before, but pushed deeper this time. The trees thickened, and the sun filtered through like it was moving through smoke. I liked it. I stopped often to listen. It felt good to not have anywhere to be, no notifications buzzing in my pocket. After about 2 hours of slow hiking, I found an old shed. Not part of the cabin listing, not mentioned in any of the paperwork I'd seen. It was maybe 8 feet by 10 with a sagging roof and a door that hung off one hinge. It looked like it had been abandoned for a long time. Moss grew along one side, and the steps were half buried in dirt and leaves. I didn't go inside. Something about it made me uneasy. Not in a dramatic way, just a sense that it didn't need to be disturbed. I circled it once, glanced inside through the doorway without stepping in. I could see old tools, a rusted saw, some kind of bench, a coil of rope hanging on the wall. I told myself I'd check it out more later and headed back. That night, I slept poorly. I kept waking up. There wasn't much sound, just the usual creaks and wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At one point, I got up and shined my flashlight out the front window. Just trees, shadows. Nothing strange. Still, my chest felt tight. On the third day, I almost didn't hike. I wanted to just sit on the porch, read, drink coffee. But the air felt good, and I didn't like the idea of wasting the day. I took the same path again, thinking I might go past the shed this time. Maybe find a creek or a ridge or something new. I passed the shed around noon. Same as before, quiet still. But this time, the door was closed. I was sure it had been wide open before. It hung loose and crooked, but it had definitely been open. I stood there for a while, staring at it. Then I kept walking. I made it about another 30 minutes deeper when I started getting the feeling again. That heavy, close sense of being watched. It was the kind of thing I kept trying to explain away. Maybe I was just tired, or hungry, or still wound up from work. But it didn't go away. I kept stopping to listen. Nothing. Just the sound of my own breath and the occasional bird. But I couldn't relax. Eventually, I turned back. I told myself it was just getting late. But the truth was I didn't like the way my skin was crawling. I passed the shed again on the way back. Still shut. Still too quiet. I paused again. I didn't want to go inside, but I also didn't like not knowing what was in there. I stepped up, nudged the door with my boot. Creaked open. The inside smelled like mold and old oil. I stepped in carefully, my flashlight cutting through the dim. There was more than I remembered. Tarp in the corner. A small pile of empty cans. Scratches on the wall near the floor, like something had tried to claw out. I backed out slowly. I didn't like it. I didn't run, but I walked fast all the way back. That night, I locked the cabin door. It didn't feel like it would do much. The lock was flimsy, and the wood was old, but it was something. I kept the flashlight next to me in bed, fully dressed. I lay there for hours, listening. Sometime past midnight, I heard a noise, like a single step, maybe two, right outside the cabin. Then nothing. I sat up slowly, heart hammering. I didn't move for what felt like a full hour. Eventually, I dozed off sitting up. The first light, I packed everything. I didn't care that I'd paid for another night. I didn't even eat. I shoved everything into my duffel and threw it in the car. As I was locking up the cabin, I looked at the porch. A single muddy boot print. Not mine. Smaller. Narrower. I didn't take time to think it through. I got in the car and started driving. The road was rough and I had to slow down more than once, but I didn't stop until I had signal again and saw other cars on the main road. I never reported anything. I didn't know what I'd even say. I didn't know if someone had been watching me or living in that shed or just messing with me. I just knew I wasn't going back. The next week, I checked the listing site. The cabin was gone. No trace of it. I haven't taken another solo trip since. I think about that shed sometimes. The rope, the claw marks, the boot print. I try not to, but it creeps in late at night, especially when I hear noises in my house that I can't explain right away. I don't know who or what was out there. I just know that whatever it was, it knew I was alone, and it waited until the last night to show itself. And that's enough for me to never go back.